Today I want to talk a little bit about the glycemic index. This is something that some of you guys may have heard about, but it might be completely new to others of you. Basically, the glycemic index is a way to rank food based on how they may or may not impact your blood glucose. So the idea is that a food that is higher up on the index will impact your blood glucose more. It will raise it higher. What ends up happening when your blood glucose goes higher, your body releases more insulin. And if we have this constant state of higher insulin in our blood, our cells can potentially become insulin resistant. The more we discover, the more that is not a good thing, or at least that's what the science is supporting at this point, is that this insulin resistance is potentially what's driving a lot of our chronic diseases. So we want to avoid that. So people have turned to the glycemic index to give them an idea of what foods could potentially be driving the glucose in their blood, which again then drives the insulin. So if they can lower the glucose, they lower the insulin. Hopefully that seems better. Glycemic index is a way to figure out what foods might be causing the problem. The problem with the glycemic index, though, is it's a bit more complicated than most people think. First off, there's not just one glycemic index. There are actually multiple different kinds. And it really depends on what food is being used to control, meaning that you need some kind of food to compare against for this glycemic index to work. So typically you're gonna have white bread or glucose as your control. And the dosage is a 50-gram carbohydrate dose. That doesn't mean that if you were to go home and weigh out 50 grams worth of white bread, you would have to know the grams of carbohydrate in that white bread. That's a little bit complicated, but just know it's 50 grams of carbohydrate, not the weight of the food itself. So if you have 50 grams of white bread, that's your control, so that gets a score of 100. So everything is compared to that. Or same thing with glucose. You get a 50-gram load of glucose, that becomes 100 and everything is compared to it. So what that looks like is if you took a 50-gram carbohydrate load of baked russet potato, it would have a glycemic index of 107.7, which means it would elevate your blood glucose more than a piece of white bread. Now, if you took that same 50-gram dose of baked russet potato and compared it to glucose as the control, it's 76.5. So it would not elevate your blood glucose as high as pure glucose would. I hope that you guys can understand that. I'm not gonna walk through the whole list, but you can see I've done this for several different things here. And so it depends on which version of the glycemic index you're using, what the number actually looks like. So that's the first little bit of confusion, is which glycemic index are we really working with? Beyond that, there's also the issue of load. So what load means is that, as I said, this is a 50-gram dose of carbohydrate, but you may or may not actually be eating 50 grams worth of carbohydrate from that food on any given day. Carrots are my favorite example of this. A lot of people avoid carrots when they're watching the glycemic index because carrots, when compared to glucose, have a glycemic index of 71. That seems pretty high. The problem is to get 50 grams of effective carbohydrate from carrots, you'd have to eat 1.5 pounds. Let me say that again, 1.5 pounds of carrots to get 50 grams of carbohydrate. That's a lot of carrots, and I don't know who is sitting down and eating like 1.5 pounds of carrots at one shot within a short enough period of time that it's actually gonna have an impact on the blood sugar. So instead, if we take into consideration a normal dose or a normal serving size of carrots, say roughly, 2 medium carrots, that's gonna actually only give you a glycemic load of 7.1. So that's a radically different load than if you were just going by the glycemic index, if you were actually looking at glycemic load, because it takes into consideration proper serving size. Let's get even more complicated with this, right? There are all sorts of other things that can impact the kind of load or how much these foods can raise your glucose. Things like whether the food is hot or cold. Here's a fun fact. A hot boiled red potato has a glycemic index when compared to glucose of, I believe it's 89. That same potato when cold has a glycemic index of 56. It's a radical difference just based on temperature. And that may or may not be clear when you're looking at these indices. Same thing with what are the other foods in the meal, right? Most of us are probably not sitting down just eating a whole meal of bananas or couscous. We're probably eating that with other things. So you add some fat in there, or you have some protein that may slow down the body's ability to absorb the glucose, so it's not gonna spike as high. All of these things have an impact on how this actually plays out in the body. The final piece of that too is we're all highly variable. This is based on sort of statistics and raw data and you just compare across the board. But each individual could have a very radically different response. There's more and more science that's showing us that one person might respond to a banana with a spike in blood sugar and then it drop back down. And another person could have it just sort of slightly come up and even out and then go back down again. We believe that maybe some of that impact is coming from the variability in the gut microbiome. We don't really know though. It's part of just being human that we have all of this high variability in how our body responds to food. So while the glycemic index may be a useful tool in some ways, because for the most part, it's going to tell you that foods that are highly processed are going to be higher on that index, and foods that are more real, whole, nutrient-dense foods are going to generally be lower. I'd rather people not use this as the sole measure of whether or not a food should be eaten or a part of the diet, right? Because if you do use this, then carrots might get taken out of your diet, and you might not ever want to eat a banana or raw pineapple. Because if you look at this, if you compared it just based on these numbers alone, Coca-Cola looks better than raw pineapple. I think we can all use our brains to know that there's something wrong there, right? Coca-Cola should not ever be thought to be a more nutrient-dense food than raw pineapple. And at the end of the day as well, how a food impacts your blood glucose, while important, is not the sole measure of the healthfulness of a food. Foods are whole things, and our bodies are whole things. These are interconnected, multivariate systems, and we need to treat them as such. So one particular measure may or may not be the right way to take a look at food. So for me, I think the glycemic index is more often misused rather than useful. That's it for today. Send us your questions if you have them.